everybody. Happy Monday. We have the incredible Ryan Grimm in this morning for Sagar and Jetty. Great to have you, Ryan.
Left-wing populist takeover.
That's right. Actually, we are going to have Emily join us, though, so that we can reflect on Trump 100 days and not have total left-wing Trump derangement syndrome over here. So
get our snark in now before Emily shows up. Yes.
Exactly. And for those of you who are wondering, baby is not coming yet that we know of, at least this morning, but Sagar is having to deal with a few things there, so he'll be in later this week, assuming that, you know, things hold in place.
A lot of appointments the last week or two.
Indeed, yeah, a lot going on. So also a lot going on in the world. We are going to dig into all of the polling that has come out with regards to where Trump is as he hits 100 days this week, both on the top line numbers, where he is economically, the way things have moved even on issues like immigration, how his own supporters are thinking about the first 100 days. We're going to take a look, of course, at the latest with the trade war. Shein prices are up and shipping traffic is way, way down. So, you know, Americans starting to feel the pain at places like Temu and Shein. We'll see how that reaction goes. We wanted to cover some of the things that have happened with regard to immigration and deportations. That Wisconsin judge was arrested last week. There's also some additional things that we've learned. ICE having deported several U.S. citizen children as young as 1, 2, 4 years old, one of them suffering from cancer. So we'll dig into that. We also have Bernie clapping back at Alyssa Slotkin and Justice Democrats revealing their first candidate this cycle, something Ryan had sort of exclusive access to or early access to. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We also have a bit of an international flair in the show today. This is also partly because Ryan is here and he has done such incredible reporting in Pakistan, but also this is an incredibly important story for everyone. India and Pakistan inching closer to potentially a war, both of them, of course, nuclear armed superpowers. So that's certainly something we want to keep our eye on. And Canadians going to the polls today as well. So we're going to have David Dole join us to break down the twists and turns in that race, which has been really centered around our own president here, Trump.
Yeah, and for the India-Pakistan story, we'll have Siddhartha Roy, who wrote a really prescient investigative piece for us about Jammu and Kashmir a couple weeks ago at Drop Site. And we'll also have, I pre-interviewed Waqas Ahmed, who a lot of you know is our terrific Pakistani reporter who's here in exile in the United States, and just to talk about whether or not we're going to get a nuclear war out of this. But before,
seems like an important discussion.
Yeah, I think that's rather important. Yeah, and before we start on that, because we won't have time to talk about the latest updates in Israel-Palestine over the weekend, the murder spree has just gotten out of control. And people in Gaza are saying that, and it's easy to get cynical about this, but people in Gaza are saying that the amount of slaughter is at a scale unlike it's been previously.
Wow. Like,
I think 53 people killed on Saturday, more than 50 killed on Sunday, just 17 killed overnight into Monday morning.
Wow.
Meanwhile, Netanyahu gave a speech where he insisted that Israel will not accept an Iran nuclear deal unless there's a complete obliteration of Iran's civilian peaceful nuclear program. It's like, this is a U.S.-Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
It's so like,
well, we'd like to pretend it is anyway.
Yes,
we'd like to imagine that it is.
So, but the question is, can he actually bomb Iran without U.S. support? And according to Tulsi Gabbard and Michael Waltz and all these other intelligence officials, no. They can't successfully pull it off. So it actually isn't up to him.
Yeah. Well, we were talking before the show, you know, Shia Ben Ephraim, who we've described as a liberal Zionist and had on this show, he has been slowly sort of evolving in his views. And he even just now came out and said, listen, it's undeniable, it's a genocide. Oh. And basically what tipped him over, and personally, I think at this point, there's no real serious debate that you can have about whether or not it's a genocide. And what tipped him over in particular is here they are just outright starving, however many people are left in the Gaza Strip. You now have dozens of people who have already died of starvation. We know Abu Bakr was suffering malnutrition. I'm sure there are so many people in Gaza, potentially basically all of
everyone,
them, suffering from malnutrition at this point. You know, the food and the aid remains blocked. The Trump administration does not appear to be applying any pressure, regardless of what their State Department spokesperson may say, in order to allow that food aid in. And so, I mean, the clock is ticking on, you know, an escalated extermination campaign, and that's where we are right now.
Yep.
So, all right, well, without that grim update, No pun intended. Out of the way. Want to go ahead and get to the very latest with regards to where the Trump administration is at this morning. And as we said, we have a special guest joining us to help us understand what has happened in this first 100 days and how the public feels about it. And that is our own Emily Jashinsky. All right, guys, so Trump administration officially hits 100 days this week. I think we have a fancy graphic we can put up on the screen there with the count up, I guess, to 100 days. I think we're officially at, 98 today or something like that. But all of the polling outfits, 99, 100 days, all of the polling outfits have done their official, 100 days. Where's he at? Digging into the top line numbers, also where he is on an issue by issue basis. So let's go ahead and put up on the screen this graphic that we made with all of the different outlets and where they see his approval at this point. Just a note, the one on the end there, that's the Harvard Kennedy School. That's just 18 to 29-year-olds. So that's why the numbers there look a little different. But very noteworthy among that age demographic, which had been sold as, really shifting to the right and, of course, voted for Trump in more significant numbers than young people had voted for previous Republican candidates in the past, including Donald Trump himself in 2016. But, overall, the picture here is not a pretty one if you are the current president of the United States. I think the best ratings you've got there are about 11 points underwater. You've got him dipping into the 30s in at least one of these polls. All of them seem to be clustered around low 40s in terms of the approval rate. Really, effectively, Emily, I think at this point you can say pretty officially the honeymoon is over. This looks very much like Trump polling that we saw in the first term. And he came into this office with, for him, fairly positive approval rating. It was roughly around 50-50, even had a little bit of an edge, above water in some of the polls early in his term. Now, with a combination of tariffs and even things that had previously been strong points for him, like immigration, going sideways and receiving net negative approval ratings, he is left in a position of unpopularity, which is one that he will be familiar with from the past.
Yeah, that's a good point. First of all, that graphic is so helpful and incredible. I like that we're now aggregating the poll aggregations by Politics and New York Times. But what's particularly bad news for this administration is that those numbers are not like new dips. If you go and look at these charts, what they reflect is an X. It's almost, you could map the Real Clear Politics aggregation onto New York Times aggregation. Somewhere around March 10th, 11th, Trump crosses the 48% approve, disapprove sort of watermark, and then keeps moving in the other direction. So he starts above water and is dipping, and then he starts his disapproves start to go up as the approves start to go down. So this is that sounds very obvious, but the point is this is a steady trend over the first 100 days of decline. And Krystal, before we got going, you sent a chart that was also really interesting, which aggregated Trump's polling numbers on particular issues. Mm-hmm. Basically, the only one that he is remaining at a decent level on is immigration. And even that, he is below water. Now, the only other thing I'll add is people in the administration are hearing a lot, and we've talked about this on the show, about Ronald Reagan in 1981, that Ronald Reagan was able to weather a recession and all of the political consequences that came with Paul Volcker and the shock, and win re-election by 1984. Even though the economy hadn't, arguably, quote unquote, recovered. That is what this administration, granted, Trump doesn't have to run again, although God knows he may, but he's the second-term president. So you expect to see a little bit more thicker skin to public reaction. But in this case, they're also really hoping that they're able to land the plane at some point when it comes to the politics of public opinion. That right now what they're doing is dramatic shock. They had the mandate, and so they're shocking the country, not just on tariffs, but on everything. But the numbers are not reflecting a positive, obviously, political reaction to any of that.
Man, I'm really sorry to hear that, because I was wondering, too, that whether or not they were starting to think of Reagan in his first term and think, you know what? Okay, yeah, we are actually going to drive the economy into recession, but that's okay because Reagan did it, too. Now, of course, in 82, Democrats had this massive wave. And then, then there was a giant landslide that reelected Reagan in 1984. The difference, of course, is that Reagan was elected, you could argue, to do something about runaway stagflation and inflation. And he, in combination with Volcker, I don't think he was totally happy with everything Volcker was doing, but in combination with Volcker, that was aimed at addressing something that voters did say that they were upset about. Now, voters have said that they're upset about the collapse of manufacturing over the last 50 years and the hollowing out of the middle class. And we talked a lot on this show about how at least Trump was acknowledging that concern, and the proxy for that acknowledgement was him talking about tariffs. But then when he comes in and does it this way and drives the country into recession, it's not exactly what people were hoping was going to happen. And so a lot of the conversation seems to be like, did people vote for this or not? Like, is this what people had in mind? Let's put up Nate Silver, and this is one more chart that suggests no, like this is not exactly how people, felt like this was going to go. So, how are people squaring that? Are they really saying to themselves, all right, we can actually blow the economy up because Reagan did, and Reagan was fine, and he was fine. That's right. Like if that's your model, you're like, yeah, you actually can survive.
And just to before you grab that question, Emily, one thing to add to that is it's the polar opposite. People voted. The number one thing they said is we want inflation to come down.
Yes.
And Trump's like, how about price increases? So I'm sure. I also think in some ways I find the question of like, is this what people voted for or not to be a little bit silly because, voters, like, there's a whole basket of things that go into their vote. I think to think of it as like, here's my checklist and this is specifically the issues on which I am voting is just not a realistic assessment of how most voters go about casting their ballot. So I find the question itself to be a little bit silly. But to the extent that people were casting a ballot on one issue in particular, inflation was certainly among the top, if not the top issue. And instead, not just on tariffs, but on the immigration policy as well. These are inflationary policies that are almost certain to raise prices significantly, at least in the short term.
The Ryan Grimm voter checklist is whether the Eagles will actually show up at the White House if they win the Super Bowl. No, I think that's true. And the other thing I think could be happening here is because the tariffs were such a dramatic, this administration has been doing all kinds of like generational projects of the conservative movement that are dramatic, and conservatives will quibble with the process, even though Trump is sort of finally handing to them on a silver platter what they've been asking some Republican president to do for decades and decades. So a lot of this is like dramatic, it is radical, and people would say that, but the tariffs in particular, because the markets and the sort of material effects on people's conditions, they are going to be remembered as the thing that maybe changed the trajectory of public opinion on Trump. But actually, what we've seen in these charts, and you can see it if we put the last one back up again, the Nate Silver one, that's an X, and the X starts to happen before Liberation Day. It's right around like March 10th, March 11th. That's New York Times has it at March 10th. The Real Clear Politics one has it around the same time. So that's before Liberation Day. This trend was happening for Trump very steadily before
but then look
Liberation
at Liberation
Day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice,
and so
April 1st line there.
Right. Yeah. The gap opens up definitely around Liberation Day. But the point I'm trying to make basically is that the group of people who are independents, who aren't hardcore partisans, who showed up and voted for Donald Trump because of inflation or because of immigration, frankly, that's the group of people that probably is looking around and saying, I voted against Joe Biden. I thought Trump would, make the economy better. I thought that he would be the only one who had the sort of political guts to take care of what they saw as a wildly out of control immigration system. And they're looking around now and they're like, okay, so those deportations don't seem to be going well. Whether you're from the left or the right, maybe you even want mass deportations. And you're like, well, that doesn't mean sending people to CCOT. And on top of that, the market has been in flux. There's precarity, uncertainty, layoffs. So you can see how that 1-2 punch is catching up with Donald Trump, with that group of voters who's not the partisan left or the partisan anti-Trump or the partisan pro-Trump.
I think you make an important point, Emily, which is I do think the tariffs are the most unpopular, and they're so dramatic and they directly impact people's material well-being. And you have huge numbers that say my personal financial situation right now is getting worse. You have majorities who say, I expect it to get even worse over the coming years. People are expecting price hikes. Like, I do think that probably in terms of the souring of public opinion is the most important thing. But I also do think the fact that he has taken on so much water on what had previously been his most popular issue, which is immigration, because there was so much conversation about these, the horrific deportations to CCOT and the, just total erasure of any sort of due process, the revelations that, they can't really produce evidence that any of these people so far that we've learned about who were sent there were actual hardened gang members. And then specifically the conversation around Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And if you poll people on the handling there, I mean, it's a landslide in the direction of, this should not have been done and this man should not be disappeared and they should bring him back, et cetera. I do think that bringing him underwater on even his most popular issue has also been an important part of the acceleration in his favorability decline. And so, we look at that April 1 demarcation, that's Liberation Day, but April is also when we start to really focus in on some of these stories around immigration that people are frankly horrified by.
Let's put up A5 while Emily answers there.
Yeah, this is quite an interesting chart to look at. And I think that's an important point, because this administration is stealing themselves, and they sort of know, and they went in, they had this totally contradictory narrative. On the one hand, they had a mandate. On the other hand, handling that mandate could be pretty unpopular. And Trump is having historically a shorter honeymoon than other presidents. So some of these trends we're talking about are totally normal. You start pretty high and then steadily decline throughout your presidency. We're talking about a steady decline over the first 100 days, not the entire presidency. And so to some extent, the Trump administration and people involved in this steeled themselves because they knew they were about to do some pretty dramatic policy changes. And on the other hand, I don't know that the public thought that the drama would go beyond, these kind of common sense policies on immigration or common sense, handling of the economy. And I'm saying that, regardless of whatever particular policy, that Donald Trump is the alternative to Joe Biden because he has this, in the minds of some voters, he's not the guy who was responsible or oversaw the inflation or oversaw the big immigration numbers. And so Trump will look around and say, I'm cleaning up Joe Biden's mess. But what happens now is Donald Trump and Republicans are just consistently betting on Democrats being even less popular than they are. This is a trend of the Trump era, that Donald Trump is, so polarizing that they just need basically a second term Joe Biden, or they need someone who is as, uniquely unpopular as Hillary Clinton. That's their only path to the White House in the Trump era, as long as Trump dominates politics, because he is so polarizing. And to some extent, that becomes a bubble, right? Because you lose the will to recapture significant swaths of the public.
And I can understand why so much of the public didn't expect Trump to make these kinds of moves when it came to immigration. Because I think back to, Emily, remember that zero hedge debate that we hosted on immigration? It was Robbie Suave and the Libertarian presidential nominee on one side against Jack Posobiec and some other
Ryan Gerdesky.
Ryan Gerdesky. Yeah. He's far, far right dudes. And I remember being surprised myself at how bonkers they were. They're like, we need to go to war with the cartels. We need to, deploy the army in American cities. And I knew that those views were out there, but I'm like, oh, these are fairly influential people who will have the ear of even more influential people like Stephen Miller, if Trump wins. And so despite doing news shows basically every day, I hadn't quite absorbed, how committed and how radical they were until that debate. And so then seeing them actually execute it, it's not surprising that the public is recoiling. But I'm curious, as you talk to people in that universe, do they feel chastened at all, or are they more like Stephen Miller was over the weekend, I don't know if you guys saw this rant he gave where he's like, we need to get these communists, off the court, and if you think that they're going to stand in the way of President Trump getting the terrorists out of your neighborhood, you've got another thing coming. He was just full on, maniacally, we're full steam ahead on this. So, are they checking themselves at all based on these numbers, or is it no? This is our shot to carry out a revolution, and we're going to do it.
The Stephen Miller clip is very representative. The one that you're just referencing is very representative.
They're feeling it.
And Ryan, well, yeah, I mean, so this hardened core absolutely is. I remember Ryan walking out of that debate and just like taking a deep breath and being like, "Holy shit!"
So even you were surprised by like, yeah, like whoa.
It was a lot. Yeah, it was a lot. But I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is that the Trump administration felt it had the wind at its back with the public on immigration and on the economy, to the extent where they said this is a generational opportunity to take dramatic steps, corrective steps in their mind that further the like broader conservative project, which is pushing back on a century of, as they see, like Wilsonian administrative sprawl. And so they right now feel as though, because the public gave them this permission, that this is exactly like and to some extent, this is going to be controversial. They're kind of right? Like if the alternative is totally open borders as people see it, or Stephen Miller, some people are still going to be siding with Stephen Miller in the public because the other policy is so awful. And that's what gives them this idea that they can keep digging further and further, pushing further and further. And that's obviously where you end up alienating the public, because at some point the policies of Democrats are not that bad compared to sending people to CCOT. So they are like that, because this is the hardened core who now feels like they have been vindicated. They are absolutely riding high. They are feeling like they should be dunking on reporters left and right every single day, and they're ready to do battle. And I think that may come back, and I shouldn't say may, that will come back to bite them, because the public, you have to be able to sort of absorb where the public is if that's part of your goal.
Well, I mean, this relates to actually the other conversation we were having before this started, which is this revelation of these, signal chat groups. Chatham House, Ben Smith did the reporting, and you've got, David Sachs and Tucker Carlson and all these like right-wing media figures and all these right-wing tech billionaires all inside of this chat group. And basically, David Sachs sort of threw a fit about some of them having quote unquote Trump derangement syndrome and like exited the chat. But to me, that's emblematic, first of all, of how captured right-wing quote unquote independent media is, that they're just like, propagating these narratives that are being fed to them directly by billionaires. But in addition, it's also emblematic to me of what a increasingly tight bubble they are keeping themselves in. So, and that has been kind of, an intentional project of Trump 2.0, is if there's anyone out there that even may disagree on anything we're doing, we don't want anything to do with them. And you pointed that out, Emily, with regard to the trade agenda. You don't have Bob Lighthizer in there anymore. You've got Peter Navarro, right? Because Lighthizer is, yes, he's a protectionist, but this is, someone who has his own ideas about things and is intellectual and would go about this in like some sort of an intentional way, potentially. And instead, you have Navarro, who's fresh out of prison, and who is an absolute ideologue, unmovable ideologue, driving the train with regard to tariffs alongside, Trump himself. That seems to be the one part of the agenda that Trump himself is really taking ownership of. Meanwhile, I think the whole immigration portfolio and foreign policy apparently too has been outsourced to Stephen Miller. So you have these, and then all the Doge piece, whatever that was, of course, outsourced to Elon Musk. So you have sort of these incredibly ideological, off-the-rails type figures who are completely managing whatever their, ideological hobby horse is. And as I said, the whole intent of Trump 2.0 is to make sure that there is no one in the room who's going to say, this is a bad idea, this is illegal, this is unconstitutional, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to resign. Like, that has been a concerted effort to make sure that's the case. And so, they're in a complete and total bubble. And I think they also, they feel like, well, the pollsters were wrong about us before, and the economists were wrong before. And so there's no external feedback that is going to really move us off of whatever our, wild ideological project happens to be.
I think that's a really good point, that because there's such like limited trust in media feedback, and perhaps reasonably so on that point, and polling, that people don't, they're like, well, what we're doing is popular. This is exactly what everyone voted for. So yes, we are going to keep sending alleged MS-13 people to El Salvador. But on that point, this is really interesting what you said, Krystal, because I think about even the fact that Peter Navarro was in prison and how that changed this second Trump administration after all of the investigations and escalations in the lawfare. It's like they are applying these litmus tests for loyalty that from just a pure like management standpoint, if this were not the United States of America, but some type of corporation, you would be like, okay, what you're doing here, maybe there's some management logic to it, because the litmus test is saying you are not counter signaling. This is, that to the point that like they've executed or not executed, excluded, not executed yet, but excluded people from the circle that are critical. They see that as counter signaling, and their litmus test is total loyalty, because if you don't pass that litmus test, you're a potential vulnerability in the administration. You're a potential squeaky wheel. You're the potential, Cassidy Hutchinson, who, or whatever the other girl was, who came out in the January 6th hearings. Liz Cheney, by the way, was someone who was really close with Trump circles and Trump 1.0. You're the squeaky wheel that can get us in trouble down the road. And so because of that, they've really purged people who are willing to be internal critics, because you don't pass the litmus test. And when there's that genuine hesitation to criticize internally, even the trajectory, then you end up with a chilling effect, and you end up with everyone just hopping on the bandwagon of every idea that a Stephen Miller has, or that Donald Trump, frankly, has.
And what I also found interesting about this first 100 days is what Trump didn't do, which is basically pass anything through Congress. He did the Lake and Riley Act in the first couple of days, which is, Democrats just gave him whatever they wanted when it came to immigration, because they were really on their heels. But since then, it's probably been the least productive it's definitely been the least productive first 100 days of any new president who controlled Congress in like modern, in memory. Instead, he's focused on executive orders, and he's focused on kind of concentrating power in the executive by going after law firms, going after, trying to gut universities, rounding up students, the trade war, things that he can do on his own, and then having his top administration officials complain that the laws are such that they get in the way of him being able to do it legally. Like this J.D. Vance saying, "Look, what do you want us to do? All these people came in, and now it's really cumbersome to get them out." Meanwhile, of course, though, there is progress being made legislatively. The reconciliation package is moving. The budget, continues to move. Are you impressed by what you've seen moving through Congress, and do you think he's going to be able to, like in the longer run, get this reconciliation bill, the tax cut bill through, and divert? He's trying to divert tens or maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars over to ICE. Their current budget is something like $9 billion. He wants to put that up somewhere between 300 and 500, which is like silly. Like they don't have the capacity to spend that amount of money. The point is they would have more money, and money would be no object for what they're trying to accomplish. Do you think that they're sufficiently committed to that they're going to get some of these things done?
This is a really quiet source of tension on the right, because a lot of people who are sort of architects of unitary executive theory, which is where this administration has spent the bulk of its first 100 days focused, meaning they're trying to retake power that they feel has been wrongly delegated to bureaucrats and the administrative agencies. People who support that also say that's going to require a lot of codification through Congress. You can't just do this. We've seen this come up in certain court cases time and again, that this has to be done through Congress. If you want to get rid of USAID or the Department of Education, you can't do it with an executive order. You can't just dismantle the agency. You can dismantle it in certain ways, but ultimately you have to pass an act through Congress. And they're all everyone you talk to in Trump circles is pretty sure the midterms are not going to go well for them, that they're probably going to lose the House. And that's where it's sort of 2025 is such a different year year than before Congress got sclerotic and did absolutely nothing. That's downstream of our politics. We could probably talk about Newt Gingrich for a long time and how that came to pass. But the point is, I mean, this should be a robust legislative agenda. They should be able to be whipping up bills and getting them through Congress. They don't even have to be big, like omnibus type bills. But they can't, because they're stuck on these stupid budget battles, and because so much of the energy right now is in taking power back from the executive branch that they can't even augment that with Article 1 type of activity. So I think that's actually going to be a bigger tension in the next 100 days of the Trump administration, because a whole lot of the people who are the policy architects here are going to want to see stuff go through Congress before the midterms.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.